I chose the title for this video very carefully because I wouldn't call these books necessarily bad books. I normally do like, hey, worst books, all the worst books I read this year, but I couldn't bring myself to use that title because none of these books are necessarily bad. To be honest, this was the best reading year that I've had, like consistently good books, like ever, probably. So I normally have something to at least rail against at the end of the year. Like last year would have been Children of Men, or the year before that would have been like the Endymion books. Like I normally have something that I just really didn't enjoy reading. But this year, not so much. So like I said, they're not bad books, but they were a disappointment to me on one level or another, which now that I say that out loud kind of sounds worse than they were bad. Could you imagine somebody being like, you weren't bad, you're just a disappointment? Like, fuck, that's heavy. Anyway, starting off with the first, I do have these in order from least disappointing to most disappointing. So in keeping in line with ranking things, we're going to start with A Feast for Crows. And I know it has its defenders, and it's everybody. There are the ones that it's my favorite book in the series. That's great. I'm glad you liked it. It was the least for me. It came at the bottom of the list. I thought that splitting the narratives when it came to A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons was a mistake. It would have been better if they left the stories together. They flowed better when they were mixed together. Everything worked better. It held my engagement better. Everything just worked better when they were mixed the way they had originally been. And then he even remixed them for like the last part of Dance with Dragons anyway. So what was the point of splitting them? I'll never understand it. Just so we would all unanimously agree, almost unanimously agree, that Feast for Crows is not a good book. It just was the weakest of the one because he chose to split it. Anyway, and it was a good book. It was a really good series. I mean, it just, everything about it was genuinely good. It was so well written, this series. And I feel kind of bad putting it on this list, but I would feel disingenuous if I didn't put it on this list because it was the weakest of the one. And it was disappointing the way he chose to tell this story. It really was. Next up, of course, is going to be The Blade itself. And I'm just going to get myself in trouble the more I talk about this book because I almost always get somebody in the comments, this guy doesn't even know what he's talking about. Well, I'm sorry, it's my opinion. I didn't think The Blade itself was a very good book. I think it was a good introduction to a series, and I think the overall series was good. I also feel like it is just by far the weakest of the 3 books in the series, and I feel like it's not a good book by itself. And I am one of those people who believes that the first book in a series has 2 jobs, and it is to be a good introduction to the series and also to be a good book in and of itself. This succeeded on one front and it failed on the other. I put right on the thumbnail when I reviewed the entire trilogy, weak start, strong finish. And this is the weak start to that trilogy. It's a good trilogy. It's a good introduction to that trilogy, but it doesn't really do what it should have done as a book. Now, I think this is also, if I'm not mistaken, isn't this like the first thing that Joe Abercrombie ever wrote? So, I mean, let's all forgive him for that because who hits the floor running? Go watch my first video that I ever put on YouTube. It's shamefully bad. He did a way better job at starting out as an author as I did as a YouTuber. That's for sure. But it doesn't change how I feel about the book. Next up is my boy, Steve-O Kingo. I always have to put him on my disappointing list of video. I don't know. I put him on all of my bad lists, like overrated lists. I always find a way to get a Stephen King book in there because he's my favorite author of all time. And he's got enough books that, believe me, some of them aren't great. This one isn't a bad book, but it was so disappointing. I prepped for this book. This is The Talisman. And it was like, ooh, this is a collaboration between Peter Straub and Stephen King, and Peter's supposed to be some amazing author because everybody puts like Ghost Story on their top 10 list. So I was like, I prepped for this book by going and getting Ghost Story and reading through that so I could have like a baseline of what kind of a writer Peter Straub was before I went into the collaboration between Straub and King. And like, so I did homework for this, and I get to the book and I was like, well, that was lackluster. It was like, I don't know, The Dark Tower Light. Not even. We're going into the other realm. I can't even remember what the other realm was called, but it was like the Dark Tower Light, but not as good. And then everybody raves about this wolf guy who's supposed to be like their favorite character in the book, and I found him kind of annoying. I didn't really care for his character. He might have been my least favorite character in the book. Like, he just kind of got on my nerves a little bit. I don't know. Anyway, not a bad book, but I was excited to read it. And when I read it, it was not near as good as I wanted it to be. So anyway, and I did homework for that book. Although, in all fairness, the homework that I did was to read Ghost Story. That's a good book. So at least I got to read Ghost Story out of the deal, right? Next up on the list is Spiral by Koji Suzuki. This is the sequel to The Ring, and The Ring made its way onto my top 10 horror list of all time because The Ring is fucking amazing. It is just, I cannot express how good that book is. I literally read it in one afternoon. I could not stop reading it. It was so good. Spiral is not that good. It is a mediocre follow-up to one of the greatest horror books ever written. And it was a sad follow-up. It could have been great. Could have, the potential to be great was here. We follow a whole new character who is a friend of one of our main characters from the previous book. Then he runs into characters from the previous book. I'll try not to spoil anything. And you get to see what the character from the last book is now in their life and how it has affected them, the consequences of what happened to them in the last book and where it has put them in this book. Beautiful. All of it was great. Such a great setup to a book. Then the book goes on its primary mission of decoding the videos and how they work, and then it kind of uses them as an allegory for like actual viruses, and they apply like real life rule logic of like viruses to the real life rule logic of these videotapes. It was such a letdown. It was a bummer because we didn't need the inner workings of the videotapes explained. Horror stories and monsters and big bads and the evil that's killing you is always scariest and best when it's weird and it's enigmatic and we don't know what's happening. So when you explain it all, and you do it in the entire book, the whole purpose of the book is to explain how the videotapes work. Boo! That way to suck the scary factor right out of the books, and the fun factor was gone. And that first book, the ending, oh my God, Chef's Kiss, that first book's ending was so good because it just left you on this cliffhanger and just left that tension dialed to 11. Oh, so good. This, man, what a step down. I don't know. I wanted The Ring Part 2 or, another book like it, and it wasn't that. And of course, last but not least is Dark Matter. And this was just the most disappointing book that I read this year. And this is another one that had a great setup. I think the whole first act of this book was wonderful. I loved it. It was fun. It was fast-paced. It was everything about it was firing on all cylinders. The setup was good. The tension was good. It reads a little bit like a mile-a-minute fast-paced thriller. I don't think thrillers are great in the book department. I think thrillers work better as like a visual medium because that pacing can kind of keep you. The fact that you're slowed down by a book just because by sheer fact that you have to read the descriptions of people like, oh no, and then they turn the corner and oh no, and then it really sucks a lot out of the thriller aspect of a story when you do it in book form. So I'm not a huge thriller fan in the first place when it comes to books, but I would say the first act of this was great. Second act, starting to falter. I don't know where you're going or what you're doing. I'm hanging in there. Let's see where you take this. And then the third act hits and it fell off a cliff. It was like, I will say this is not a bad book, but the third act, that was bad. that was just bad. I mean, I can't justify it to make it in any reality where the third act of this, where I'm like, well, it was just mid, right? No, it was pretty awful. I will make excuses for the first act and the middle of the book, but I cannot in good conscience make any excuses for the end of this book. It was just tragically awful. Everything about the ending was just like, I just kind of wanted to beat my head against the wall by the time it was over. I was like, dude, what happened? Anyway, Dark Matter takes the top of the list for the most disappointing thing that I read this year. And I think that was just because I read Wayward Pines last year, and I genuinely enjoyed Wayward Pines. I think that's a really good series or trilogy of books. It's just, anyway, Dark Matter, worst book I read. Out of everything you read this year, what would you say is the most disappointing book that you read? Also, as always, everybody, the link for my Patreon is in the description below. The link for my Discord's in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.